next speaker, Mr. David Taylor. He is from Maryland. He's a young school teacher, teaches all our young little students. He will be speaking to us today about John Wilkes Booth. And he's also one of our HPR board members.
Is it afternoon yet? I think it's just about afternoon. My pocket watch worked, I can tell you. Woo! Wouldn't be the 4th of July if it wasn't nice and warm. As Bonnie said, I'm proud to be a board member of Historic Port Royal. I'm the newbie on the board, and so I'm learning all the ins and outs. I live in Maryland, and though I'm a school teacher, elementary school, I teach 3rd grade in Maryland. In my free time, I like to study the Lincoln assassination and his assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And so today, when the board was planning everything for the 4th, we thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had Dr. Sellers, a renowned Lincoln expert, talk about Abraham Lincoln, and then Dave, you can talk about John Wilkes Booth. And I, of course, happily agreed to it, because what teacher doesn't agree to speak about something they enjoy? But as I was preparing for this speech, I became a little conflicted. I could have and have gone on for hours about the assassination of Lincoln and the escape of John Wilkes Booth. But today is not April 14th, the day of Lincoln's assassination, nor is it April 26th, the day that John Wilkes Booth was cornered and killed just a few miles down the road. Today is July 4th, our Independence Day. And so if it's all right with all of you, I'd like to leave John Wilkes Booth behind and tell you a different story instead. A story not from, yes, Bonnie. Pardon me. All right, let's see if that's better.
Gather, everybody.
You hear me now? Like the old commercials? Good. All right. Not bad. So I'm going to tell you a story, not from the Civil War era like my clothes suggest, but from the Revolutionary era. The story of men who were living on the shores of our then enemy, England, and how, from even so far away, they saw the promise that was American liberty and independence. So our story begins in England, and one of our characters is a man whose name is not really important right now, so we will just call him Mr. W. Mr. W was 50 years old and had the unfortunate reputation of being known as the ugliest man in England. He had a protruding jaw that gave him a very strong underbite. His eyes were squinty, lazy, and prone to cross whenever he would talk. A truly ugly man. However, despite his physical appearance, he had a talent of quick wit and charm. He used to say that on multiple occasions, he could talk away his face and soon become friends with even the most curious stranger to his appearance. And in romance, Mr. W stated that if he had a month's head start, he could beat any rival to a lady's heart because of his face, because of his charm and his wit. And so he had a way with people. He became especially popular with the common people in England, and this translated into a career in politics. He was elected to Parliament and soon found himself supporting causes of personal liberty. He became an ardent critic of the policies and actions of the king's ministers. In those days, that was as close as you could get to criticizing the king himself, because if you tried doing that, you were liable to be thrown in prison. This made Mr. W very unfavorable to the crown and those in power. Once, he was chastised by the 4th Earl of Sandwich, the man who is credited as having invented the sandwich food that we eat. After a lively exchange in which Mr. W questioned the Earl's power-hungry policies, the Earl stated rather threateningly, "Sir, I do not know whether you will die on the gallows or of the pox." To which Mr. W quickly replied, "That depends, my lord, on whether I embrace your lordship's principles or your wife." His open critique of those in power continually got him into trouble, but the people loved him. He was expelled from Parliament 3 times, outlawed once, imprisoned twice, and exiled to Paris for 3 years. He was known as the agitator to many in England, and King George III called him the devil. But still, the common people loved him, and his quest for personal liberties. He was re-elected to Parliament while he was serving a jail sentence for criticizing the king. Unhappy with this outcome, the government declared the election void and held another one. Once again, the imprisoned Mr. W won, and the government declared the election void. This happened a total of 4 times, with Mr. W continually winning. Finally, the government gave up, decided to just appoint who they wanted, and declared the runner-up the winner, even though he had less votes. This abuse of power and blatant disregard for the electoral process was not lost on those here in the American colonies. Some of our founding fathers, like John Adams, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock, wrote letters in support of Mr. W and the right of the people to name their own representatives. As Mr. W was in prison, he was appointed as an alderman to the City of London. Upon his release from jail, he became the Sheriff of London, and 3 years later was elected the Mayor of London. Finally, in 1774, he was re-elected to Parliament, and this time he was allowed to take his seat. Mr. W was a firm supporter of the American colonies and their desire for equal rights under British law. When the King's government declared the colony of Massachusetts to be an open rebellion in 1775, Mr. W presented a strong and foretelling retort. He said, "In the most harsh manner, you are declaring them rebels. Every idea of reconciliation will now vanish. They will pursue the most vigorous course in their own defense. Whether their present state is that of rebellion or of a fit and just resistance to unlawful acts of power, resistance to our attempts to rob them of their property and liberty, as they imagine, I shall not declare. But this I know, a successful resistance is a revolution, not a rebellion. Rebellion indeed appears on the back of a fleeing enemy, but revolution, that flames on the breastplate of a victorious warrior. Who can tell, sir, whether, in consequence of this day's violent and mad address from His Majesty, that the scabbard may not be thrown away by them as well as by us? And, should success attend them, whether in a few years the independent Americans may not celebrate the glorious era of revolution of 1775 as we do that of 1688. So true Mr. W's words became when 1 year after he spoke, on this day, July 4th, 1776, we declared ourselves free and independent nation and fought the Revolutionary War to attain it. Mr. W's support for the American Revolution was widely known, so much so that October 28th, 1777, 2 young Englishmen wrote him a letter. The 2 men were unknown to him, but claimed to have a shared family ancestry. These rash youth had run off to France in hopes of booking passage to America in order to join the Continental Army and fight alongside America. While in France, the 2 men met with an American diplomat, Arthur Lee, of the famous Lee family of Stratford Hall, and brother of the Lees that Bonnie talked about earlier. Bonnie, cooking. Lee informed the 2 boys that in order to receive appointments in the Continental Army, they would first need to acquire a letter of recommendation from someone in England who was on the side of American liberty. The 2 men suggested Mr. W, and Mr. Lee, who had actually visited Mr. W while the latter was in prison, said that a recommendation from him would be more than enough. And so the youth begged Mr. W to help, writing, "Through an ardent desire to serve in the glorious cause of freedom, of which you have always been famed for being the strict and great defender, we trust the request we are about to make will be paid regard. As Englishmen, it may be urged that we are not altogether justified in taking arms against our native country, but, for as that country has almost parted with its rights, which have been given up to the present tyrannic government, it must be thought the duty of every true Briton to assist those who oppose oppression and lawless tyranny. And as the people of America are composed of men who still have the spirit of their brave forefathers remaining, it becomes all who are Englishmen to exert their utmost efforts on their behalf." The pair included a phrase in Latin, which translated says, "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, but to die for liberty is the sweetest of all." In closing the letter to Mr. W., the young man wrote, "And this favor will be gratefully remembered, and your name will always be held in the greatest respect and veneration." Though he was a firm supporter of America's quest for freedom, Mr. W. did not furnish them with the letter they required to join the Continental Army. Instead, Mr. W. wrote the boys' fathers in order to alert them that their sons had run off to France and were planning to leave the continent. A relative came and brought the boys home before they could make it to America. But the passion that these two boys had for America never faded. One of the boys, named John, managed to successfully gain passage to America a few years later. He became a lieutenant in the 1st Maryland Regiment and fought alongside General Washington at the Siege of Yorktown. The other youth, named Richard, was forced by his father to stay in England. He eventually became a lawyer, but his reverence for America never faltered. Richard placed a portrait of George Washington in the parlor of his house and exposed his love for America to all of his London neighbors. As his son recalled, "The idolatry with which my father always exhibited towards any and all things appertaining to America tended in a great measure to render him quite unpopular amidst the circle of those who but for that would have been his friends. The picture of General Washington that hung in our parlor was a rarity amongst many in London, and he insisted that all around him, friend or foe, should remove their hats while looking at it and proceed to bow to it occasionally." When Richard's son was of age, he joined the British Navy and was placed aboard the ship, the HMS Boxer. When Richard learned that the ship was shortly bound for America in order to fight for the British in the War of 1812, he had his son removed from it and the Navy, insisting that his son never fight against the country he so admired. Eventually, Richard's son became a man and in 1821 sailed for America. The man had become an actor and wanted to try his talents in the New World. In 1822, he bought some land in Maryland and invited his father to finally come and live in the country that he loved. Richard did so, finally making his way to America some 45 years after he wrote his letter to Mr. W. On the land owned by his son, the traveling actor, Richard helped tend to the farm and his growing number of grandchildren, all of which had been born in America. He was a doting grandfather, and when a 9th grandchild was born in 1838, Richard was given the honor of naming the boy. Now, many years had passed, and Mr. W. was long since dead. Yet despite this, and despite the fact that he had not written the letter of recommendation that Richard had so desired in order to fight in the Revolution, Richard still decided to name his newest grandson after that proponent of liberty that he had admired so much. That man, the ugliest man in England, the proponent of liberty, supporter of American Revolution's name was John Wilkes. And so that young infant, named by his grandfather, Richard Booth, was christened John Wilkes Booth. He would grow up to be called the handsomest man in America, and later the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln. Thank you.